Picture this. You're standing in a room full of the most powerful military leaders in the world. Every uniform is pressed to perfection, every metal gleaming under the harsh fluorescent lights. These are the people who command fleets, who make decisions that shape nations, who have never backed down from a fight in their lives. Now imagine a young woman walking into that room. She's not wearing a crisp uniform. Her clothes are simple, maybe even a little wrinkled from traveling. Her hair isn't perfectly styled, and she doesn't carry herself with the rigid posture these military minds expect. To them, she looks completely out of place. The Admiral, a man who has commanded respect across 7 seas, who has stared down enemy forces and never flinched, takes one look at her and actually laughs. Not a polite chuckle, but a real dismissive laugh. In his mind, someone clearly made a mistake. Someone sent the wrong person to the wrong meeting. But then she opens her mouth and says just 4 words. 4 simple words that will make that Admiral realize he has never been more wrong about anything in his entire career. 4 words that will change how he sees courage, intelligence, and what it really means to serve your country. What could those 4 words possibly be? And how could they have such power that a man used to commanding thousands would find himself speechless, humbled, and ultimately grateful for his mistake? This is the true story of how appearances can deceive even the sharpest minds, and how real strength sometimes comes in the most unexpected packages.
Sarah Martinez had never imagined that catching a delayed train would change her entire life. She rushed through the corridors of the Pentagon, her sneakers squeaking against the polished floors that reflected the hurried footsteps of military personnel and government officials.
Her backpack bounced against her shoulder as she checked her phone for the 3rd time in 2 minutes. She was already 20 minutes late. And she knew first impressions mattered more than anything in a place like this. The meeting she was heading to had been arranged only 3 days earlier. Sarah worked as a linguist for a small government contractor, specializing in dialects from Central Asia. Her company had received an urgent request from the Defense Department for someone who could speak Pashto, Dari, and several regional dialects from Afghanistan and Pakistan. What they hadn't told her was that she would be briefing some of the highest-ranking military officials in the country. As she approached Conference Room 4A, Sarah could hear voices through the heavy wooden door. Deep, authoritative voices, discussing logistics and strategy with the kind of confidence that came from years of command experience. She paused for a moment, smoothing down her simple black blazer and checking her reflection in the glass panel beside the door. She looked exactly like what she was, a 28-year-old graduate student who had spent more time in libraries than boardrooms. The voices inside grew louder, and she caught fragments of conversation about troop movements and intelligence reports. Her stomach tightened with nerves, but she reminded herself why she was here. 3 months earlier, she had helped decode intercepted communications that had prevented a major attack on American forces overseas. Her work had saved lives, even if no one would ever know her name. Sarah knocked twice and waited. The voices inside immediately stopped. After a moment, someone called out, "Enter," and she pushed open the heavy door. The room was exactly what she had expected and somehow still intimidating beyond her imagination. A long mahogany table dominated the center, surrounded by leather chairs that looked like they cost more than her monthly rent. The walls were covered with maps, charts, and photographs of military operations from around the world. American flags stood at attention in the corners, and the scent of coffee and leather hung in the air. But it was the people in the room that made Sarah's breath catch. 12 men in uniform sat around the table, their chests decorated with ribbons and medals that told stories of service she could only imagine. The stars gleamed from collars and shoulders, indicating ranks she had only read about in textbooks. These were generals and admirals, colonels and commanders who had dedicated their lives to protecting their country. At the head of the table sat Admiral Robert Chen, a man whose reputation preceded him into any room he entered. At 54, he had commanded naval operations in 3 different theaters of war and had earned respect from allies and enemies alike. His silver hair was cut with military precision, and his dark eyes seemed to take in everything at once. When those eyes landed on Sarah, she saw something she hadn't expected: confusion. Admiral Chen's gaze moved from Sarah to the folder in front of him, then back to Sarah. He frowned slightly, and Sarah could practically see the mental calculations happening behind his expression. He was clearly expecting someone else, someone who looked more like the experienced intelligence officers he was used to working with. The silence in the room stretched uncomfortably as every pair of eyes focused on the young woman standing in the doorway. Sarah felt heat rising in her cheeks, but she forced herself to stand straighter and meet their stares. She had faced skepticism before, though never from this many people at once and never with stakes this high.
"I'm sorry," Admiral Chen said, his voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed without question. "I think there's been some confusion. We're expecting a briefing from a linguistic specialist about current intelligence from the Afghanistan-Pakistan border region." Sarah stepped fully into the room and closed the door behind her.
That would be me, Admiral Chen. I'm Sarah Martinez from Global Language Solutions.
The Admiral's expression shifted from confusion to something that looked almost like disbelief.
He glanced around the table at his colleagues, and Sarah caught a few barely suppressed smirks from some of the other officers. One colonel near the middle of the table actually covered his mouth with his hand, as if trying to hide a smile.
"You're our linguistic expert?" Admiral Chen asked, and there was something in his tone that made Sarah's spine stiffen. It wasn't just surprise, it was doubt, pure and simple.
"Yes, sir, I am." Admiral Chen looked down at his papers again, and when he looked back up, Sarah saw the exact moment when his professional mask slipped just slightly. The corner of his mouth twitched upward, and then he actually chuckled. It started as a small sound, but within seconds it had grown into a full laugh that seemed to echo off the walls of the conference room. Several other officers joined in with their own chuckles, creating a sound that made Sarah feel like she had somehow stumbled into the wrong movie. She stood there, her hands gripping the strap of her backpack, watching as some of the most powerful military minds in the country laughed at her presence in their meeting. The laughter wasn't cruel, exactly, but it was dismissive, in a way that cut deeper than outright hostility would have.
These men saw her and immediately assumed she was out of her depth, that someone had made an obvious mistake in sending her to brief them.
They looked at her worn jeans, her comfortable shoes, her nervous expression, and they saw someone who clearly didn't belong in their world of precision and protocol.
Admiral Chen wiped his eyes and shook his head, still smiling.
"I'm sorry, miss, but I think someone in personnel made a significant error. We need someone who can brief us on current dialect variations in Taliban communications. Someone who understands the strategic implications of linguistic intelligence. We need..." He paused, clearly searching for a diplomatic way to say that they needed someone older, more experienced, more obviously qualified. "We need a real expert," finished Colonel Williams, a man whose weathered face spoke of decades spent in desert campaigns and mountain operations.
"No offense, but this briefing could determine how we communicate with local allies and interpret enemy transmissions. Lives are at stake here."
Sarah felt the familiar burn of frustration that came from being underestimated. It was the same feeling she had experienced in graduate school, when professors assumed she was taking linguistics as an easy elective. The same feeling from job interviews, where potential employers asked if she was sure she could handle the technical requirements of the work. But this time, the stakes were higher than her own pride or career prospects. She thought about the soldiers who were depending on accurate intelligence, about the families who would never see their loved ones again if communications were misunderstood or mistranslated. She thought about the intercepted message she had decoded 3 months earlier, the one that had revealed a planned attack on a military base housing over 300 American personnel. That message had been in a dialect so specific and regional that only someone with deep knowledge of tribal linguistic patterns could have understood its true meaning. The military's usual translators had marked it as routine communications about livestock trading. Sarah had recognized it as detailed instructions for an assault plan for dawn the next day. The room was still buzzing with residual laughter and murmured conversations about the apparent mix-up. Admiral Chen was reaching for his phone, presumably to call someone who could send them a real expert. Sarah knew she had perhaps 30 seconds before they politely but firmly escorted her out of the room. The movement caught Admiral Chen's attention, and he looked up from his phone with raised eyebrows, clearly surprised that she hadn't already excused herself and left. Sarah took a deep breath and let it out slowly. Then she opened her mouth and spoke the 4 words that would change everything in that room. 4 words in Pashto, delivered with the precise accent and tonal variations that could only come from years of study and natural talent.
"Daza pohegam. I understand you." But it wasn't just what she said, it was how she said it.
The words carried the subtle dialect markers of the Kandahar region, specifically the variation used by Taliban commanders when addressing their subordinates. It was a phrase that would be meaningless to most translators, but would immediately identify the speaker as someone with intimate knowledge of current insurgent communication patterns.
The laughter stopped immediately. Every conversation in the room cut off mid-sentence. Admiral Chen slowly placed his phone back on the table, his expression completely changed. The officers around the table leaned forward slightly, and Sarah could practically feel the shift in the room's energy.
Colonel Williams, who had just finished explaining why they needed a real expert, stared at Sarah with new attention. Did she just
use current Taliban command dialect with perfect regional pronunciation? Admiral Chen finished quietly.
Yes, she did.
Sarah remained standing at the foot of the table, but something fundamental had changed in the last 10 seconds. She was no longer an obvious mistake or an amusing confusion. She was exactly what they needed, and they all suddenly realized it. The silence stretched on as 12 of the most experienced military minds in the country processed what they had just heard. A young woman in worn jeans had just demonstrated a level of linguistic expertise that their usual intelligence officers could only dream of achieving. Admiral Chen cleared his throat and gestured to an empty chair near the middle of the table. Ms. Martinez, would you please join us? I believe we have significantly underestimated both you and the quality of the briefing we're about to receive. As Sarah walked around the table to take her seat, she caught the eye of each officer in turn. Where moments before she had seen skepticism and barely concealed amusement, she now saw respect, curiosity, and not a small amount of embarrassment. These were people who prided themselves on their ability to assess situations and personnel quickly and accurately. They had just learned that their assessment skills needed some serious recalibration. Sarah opened her laptop and began connecting it to the room's presentation system. "Gentlemen," she said, her voice steady and professional, "I think you'll find that the intelligence I'm about to share will significantly change your understanding of current communication patterns among insurgent groups in the Afghanistan-Pakistan border region." Admiral Chen nodded slowly, his earlier laughter now seeming like something from another lifetime. "I have a feeling you're absolutely right, Ms. Martinez. Please, proceed." As Sarah began her presentation, she couldn't help but think about how quickly everything had changed. 5 minutes earlier, she had been an obvious mistake who didn't belong in this room. Now she was exactly where she needed to be, about to share intelligence that could save American lives and change the course of military operations halfway around the world. The Admiral had laughed at her appearance, but those 4 words in Pashto had revealed a truth that went far beyond surface impressions. Sometimes the most powerful weapons come in unexpected packages, and sometimes the people who look least like soldiers are exactly the ones the military needs most. The presentation screen flickered to life, casting a blue glow across the conference room as Sarah connected her laptop to the military-grade projection system. The faces around the table had transformed completely from her entrance just minutes earlier. Where skeptical smirks had been, now sat expressions of intense focus and anticipation. Admiral Chen leaned back in his leather chair, his fingers steepled in front of him, watching Sarah with the careful attention of someone who had just realized he might learn something crucial. Sarah clicked to her first slide, which displayed a map of the Afghanistan-Pakistan border region. Red dots marked various locations where intercepted communications had been gathered over the past 6 weeks. To the untrained eye, the dots appeared random, scattered across mountainous terrain without any apparent pattern. But Sarah had spent 3 weeks analyzing these communications, and she had discovered something that would fundamentally change how the military understood their enemy's organizational structure. 3 days ago, your intelligence teams flagged 47 separate communications intercepts from this region as routine logistical discussions. Sarah began, her voice gaining confidence as she settled into her expertise. Requests for supplies, discussions about weather conditions, complaints about equipment failures, nothing that seemed strategically significant. Colonel Williams shifted in his seat. He had signed off on those exact intelligence reports, marking them as low priority and filing them away with hundreds of similar intercepts that arrived daily from the region. "That's correct. Our translation teams found nothing of immediate tactical value in any of those communications." Sarah nodded and clicked to the next slide. "Your translation teams did excellent work with the literal meanings of these messages. The problem is that they were listening to the wrong conversation." A murmur of confusion rippled around the table. Admiral Chen raised an eyebrow and leaned forward slightly. "Explain what you mean by the wrong conversation, Ms. Martinez." Sarah had practiced this explanation, knowing that what she was about to reveal would sound almost impossible to people who weren't familiar with the complexity of regional dialects and cultural linguistics. In the Kandahar dialect of Pashto, particularly among tribal groups with military experience, there are layers of meaning that go far beyond literal translation. They use what linguists call embedded semantic structures, essentially a secondary conversation hidden within ordinary-sounding requests and complaints. She clicked again, and the screen now showed 2 columns of text. The left column displayed the literal English translations that had been filed in the intelligence reports. The right column showed Sarah's reinterpretation of the same communications. The difference was startling. Where the literal translation read, "The sheep are getting sick in the north pasture and we need medicine." Sarah's interpretation read, "Northern units require immediate ammunition resupply," where the original translation said, "My cousin's wedding has been delayed because of the rain." Sarah had decoded, "Attack postponed due to increased surveillance." "Jesus Christ," whispered General Morrison, a man whose 30-year career had included tours in Iraq, Afghanistan, and Syria.
Are you telling us that we've been reading grocery lists while they were planning military operations? Sarah nodded grimly. Not just planning them. Coordinating them across a much larger network than we previously understood. She clicked to the next slide, which showed a timeline of the decoded messages arranged chronologically. When you look at these communications as tactical coordination rather than daily conversation, a pattern emerges that suggests a level of organization we haven't seen from this group before. The room fell silent as the officer studied the timeline. Admiral Chen stood up and walked closer to the screen, his expression growing more serious with each detail he absorbed. "Walk us through this pattern, Ms. Martinez. What exactly are we looking at?" Sarah used a laser pointer to highlight specific entries on the timeline. The communication starts 6 weeks ago with what appeared to be discussions about moving livestock to better grazing areas. But in the embedded dialect, these were actually instructions for repositioning weapons caches and personnel. 3 weeks ago, the frequency increased dramatically, with multiple daily exchanges about family gatherings and traditional celebrations. She paused, letting the implications sink in before continuing. "Gentlemen, they're not planning random attacks or small-scale harassment operations. They're coordinating a synchronized assault across 7 different strategic locations timed to coincide with the withdrawal of American forces from Firebase Delta." The impact of her words hit the room like a physical force. Firebase Delta was scheduled for evacuation in just 5 days, a fact that was supposed to be known only to a small circle of high-level military planners. Several officers exchanged alarmed glances, and Admiral Chen's face had gone completely pale. "How could they possibly know about Firebase Delta?" Colonel Williams demanded. "That information is classified at the highest levels." Sarah clicked to another slide showing a communication from just 2 days earlier. This message appeared to be a complaint about a neighbor's noisy roosters waking someone up too early. But in context, it's actually confirmation that they have intelligence about dawn operations planned for this week. "They know about the withdrawal timeline, Admiral Chen. They know exactly when our people will be most vulnerable." General Morrison stood up abruptly, his chair rolling backward. "We need to contact Firebase Delta immediately. If she's right about this, if I'm right, you have less than 96 hours before 7 coordinated attacks on American positions." Sarah interrupted, her voice steady despite the magnitude of what she was revealing. "And based on the frequency and sophistication of these communications, they have significantly more resources and personnel than our current intelligence estimates suggest." Admiral Chen had returned to his seat, but his posture was completely different now. Dawn was the relaxed confidence of a man attending a routine briefing. He sat forward, his hands flat on the table, staring at Sarah with an intensity that made the air in the room feel electric. "Show us everything," he said quietly. "Every communication, every decoded message, every piece of evidence you have, and I want to understand exactly how you learned to interpret these embedded meanings." Sarah spent the next hour walking them through her analysis, explaining how she had first noticed the inconsistencies while reviewing routine translations for her previous project. She described the 3 years she had spent living in rural Afghanistan as part of a linguistic research program, learning not just the formal structure of local dialects but the cultural context that gave certain phrases their hidden meanings. She explained how tribal elders used similar embedded communication techniques to discuss sensitive family matters in front of children, and how those same linguistic patterns had been adapted by insurgent groups to coordinate military actions under the noses of international surveillance efforts. The officers around the table listened with growing amazement and alarm. They were witnessing the unraveling of what they had thought was a solid understanding of enemy capabilities and intentions. Every assumption they had made about insurgent organization and communication was being systematically dismantled by a young woman who had learned to hear conversations that no one else even knew were happening. "The sophistication level we're seeing here," Sarah continued, pulling up a detailed analysis of communication patterns, "suggests coordination by someone with formal military training. These aren't random attacks planned by independent cells. Someone is orchestrating this entire operation with the kind of strategic thinking we typically see from professionally trained officers." Admiral Chen rubbed his temples, clearly processing the implications of everything he was hearing. "Do you have any sense of who might be running this coordination? Any clues about leadership structure?" Sarah hesitated for a moment, then clicked to her final slide. It showed a single communication from the previous day.
one that had arrived just hours before she left for this briefing. She had debated whether to include it, knowing that its implications were almost too significant to believe. "Yesterday, we intercepted this message," she said, her voice dropping slightly. "The literal translation makes it seem like someone complaining that their tea wasn't sweet enough. But when decoded," she paused, looking around the table at faces that were hanging on her every word. "It's a direct message from someone identifying himself as the one who learned from the Americans. He's telling his subordinates that the final preparations are complete and that the feast will begin exactly when the guests start to leave." The silence that followed was deafening. Every person in the room understood the implications immediately. Somewhere in the Afghanistan-Pakistan border region, someone who had been trained by American military advisors was now using that training to coordinate attacks against American forces. Colonel Williams was the first to speak, his voice barely above a whisper. "How many people do you estimate are involved in this coordinated operation?" Sarah looked down at her notes, then back up at the assembled officers. "Based on communication frequency and the complexity of the coordination, I estimate we're looking at between 300 and 500 personnel across 7 different groups. And if I'm reading the tactical indicators correctly, they have access to advanced weaponry and possibly anti-aircraft capabilities." General Morrison slammed his hand down on the table, causing several officers to jump. "This changes everything. We can't proceed with the Firebase Delta withdrawal as scheduled. We need to warn all American positions in the region and completely reassess our intelligence capabilities." Admiral Chen stood up slowly, his expression a mixture of professional respect and personal embarrassment that was clear to everyone in the room. He looked directly at Sarah, and when he spoke, his voice carried none of the dismissive tone from their first encounter. "Miss Martinez, I owe you an apology that goes far beyond my inappropriate reaction when you entered this room. You have just provided us with intelligence that could save hundreds of American lives and prevent a strategic disaster that we had no idea was approaching." He paused, looking around the table at his fellow officers. "More importantly, you've shown us that our current intelligence-gathering methods have a critical blind spot that could have cost us far more than we're comfortable thinking about." Sarah closed her laptop, feeling the weight of what she had just shared settling over the room like a heavy blanket. She had come here expecting to give a routine briefing about dialect variations. Instead, she had uncovered evidence of the most sophisticated enemy operation any of them had encountered in years. "What happens now?" she asked, though she suspected she already knew the answer. Admiral Chen exchanged glances with General Morrison and Colonel Williams. The unspoken communication between them lasted only seconds, but Sarah could see them reaching the same conclusion simultaneously. Now Admiral Chen said, "You're going to help us figure out how to prevent this attack and completely overhaul how we gather and interpret intelligence in this region." "And Ms. Martinez?" Sarah looked up at him expectantly. "I hope you didn't have any other plans for the next several weeks, because you've just become one of the most valuable assets the Department of Defense has in the fight against insurgent communications." "Those 4 words you spoke when you walked in here didn't just change my mind about your qualifications. They may have just changed the entire course of our operations in that region." As the meeting began to shift into crisis management mode, with officers making urgent phone calls and Sarah being asked to provide detailed analysis of every communication she had reviewed, she reflected on the strange turn her life had taken. She had walked into this room as a contractor providing routine linguistic services. She was walking out as someone who had potentially prevented a military catastrophe and earned the respect of some of the most experienced military minds in the country. The Admiral had laughed at her appearance, but her expertise had revealed truths that went far beyond anything visible on the surface. In a world where intelligence could mean the difference between life and death, sometimes the most important conversations were the ones that no one else could hear. The conference room had transformed into something resembling a war room within 30 minutes of Sarah's revelation. Secure phones rang constantly. Officers huddled around laptops receiving real-time intelligence feeds. And the large wall-mounted screens now displayed tactical maps showing American positions throughout the Afghanistan-Pakistan border region. The polished mahogany table that had seemed so formal when Sarah first entered was now covered with classified documents, communication transcripts, and satellite imagery. Admiral Chen stood at the head of the table, no longer the composed figure who had laughed at Sarah's appearance. His uniform was slightly wrinkled from leaning over maps and documents, his silver hair disheveled from running his fingers through it as he processed the implications of the intelligence Sarah had provided. Every few minutes he would look across the room at Sarah, who was now seated at a makeshift workstation with 2 military intelligence specialists, continuing to decode intercepts in real time. "Firebase Delta confirms they've received our warning," reported Colonel Williams, hanging up one of the secure phones.
they're implementing enhanced security protocols and postponing the withdrawal indefinitely. But Admiral, they're requesting clarification on the scope of the threat. They want to know if they should expect a direct assault or if this is more of a harassment operation. Admiral Chen looked to Sarah, who was studying a communication that had been intercepted just 20 minutes earlier. Mrs. Martinez, what's your assessment based on the latest intercepts? Sarah looked up from her screen, her expression grim. The latest message is concerning, Admiral. It appears to be instructions for what they call the final gathering. In the embedded dialect, this suggests they're moving to final assault positions. This isn't harassment. They're planning to overrun multiple positions simultaneously. General Morrison, who had spent the last hour coordinating with various commands throughout Central Asia, shook his head in disbelief. I've been working in this region for 15 years, and we've never seen this level of coordination from insurgent groups. How did we miss the development of these capabilities? The question hung in the air, highlighting a reality that was becoming increasingly uncomfortable for everyone in the room. The United States military, with all its advanced technology and sophisticated intelligence-gathering systems, had been essentially blind to a communication network operating right under their noses. Sarah had been asking herself the same question as she worked through more intercepts. I think part of the problem is that we've been looking for the kind of communications we would use, she said, pausing in her analysis to address the room. We expect tactical coordination to sound like tactical coordination, clear, direct, military language. But these groups have adapted to our surveillance capabilities by developing communication methods that sound completely innocent to anyone who doesn't understand the cultural and linguistic context. She gestured to the screen showing her latest decode. This message came in 15 minutes ago. The literal translation is a man asking his brother to bring extra blankets to a family gathering because the nights are getting cold. But in the embedded meaning, it's a request for additional ammunition because they expect the operation to last longer than originally planned. Captain Rodriguez, the youngest officer in the room at 32, looked up from his laptop where he had been coordinating with intelligence units across the region. Ms. Martinez, how many people would need to understand this embedded dialect system for it to work as a communication network? Sarah considered the question carefully. It was an important one, because the answer would indicate whether they were dealing with a small, highly trained group or a larger network with widespread linguistic capabilities. Based on the complexity and consistency of the communications, I'd estimate that at least 20 to 30 people need to have advanced understanding of the system to coordinate these operations. But here's what's really concerning. Some of the recent messages suggest they're teaching this communication method to additional personnel. They're expanding the network. The implications hit the room immediately. If the embedded communication system was being taught to more people, it meant the current operation might be just the beginning of a new phase of insurgent capabilities. Admiral Chen walked over to where Sarah was working and looked at the screen showing her analysis. How long would it take to train our intelligence teams to recognize and decode these embedded communications? Sarah paused her typing and looked up at him. That's the problem, Admiral. This isn't just about learning translation techniques. Understanding the embedded meanings requires deep cultural knowledge and years of experience with regional dialects. The people who developed this system have been living in these communities their entire lives. They understand not just the language but the cultural context that gives certain phrases their hidden meanings. She pulled up another screen showing the linguistic analysis she had been working on. Look at this phrase that appeared in 3 different intercepts over the last week. Literally, it translates to, "The old man's goats are wandering too far from home." But in the cultural context of this region, old man can be a respectful reference to a senior leader. Goats can represent subordinate units, and wandering too far suggests they're operating outside their normal area of responsibility. General Morrison studied the analysis with fascination and growing concern. So they're essentially speaking in code, but it's a code based on cultural knowledge rather than traditional cryptography. Exactly, Sarah confirmed. And that makes it incredibly difficult to detect or decode unless you have someone who understands not just the language but the specific cultural and social context of the communities where this dialect developed. Colonel Williams had been quiet for several minutes, studying intelligence reports from various sources across the region. Now he looked up with an expression that suggested he had reached an uncomfortable conclusion. Admiral, I've been reviewing our personnel files for linguists and cultural specialists currently deployed in the region. We have excellent translators for formal Pasha and Dari, but I don't think we have anyone else with Mizr. Martinez's level of knowledge about these specific dialect variations in embedded communication systems. The statement hung in the room like a revelation that everyone had been avoiding. The United States military, despite all its resources and expertise, was dependent on one person to understand a communication network that could potentially coordinate attacks across the entire region. Admiral Chen sat down heavily in his chair.
the weight of command responsibility visible in his posture. Miss Sensible,
Martinez, I need to ask you something, and I want you to understand that this is a request, not an order. Would you be willing to deploy to the region to work directly with our intelligence teams on the ground?
Sarah felt her stomach drop. She had expected to provide analysis and consultation, but the idea of deploying to an active combat zone was something she had never considered. Her expertise was valuable from the safety of an office in Washington, but using it in Afghanistan or Pakistan would put her directly in harm's way. She started, then paused to consider the full implications of what he was asking. Admiral, I'm not military personnel. I don't have combat training or security clearance for that kind of deployment. Those are obstacles we can overcome. Admiral Chen replied immediately. What I'm asking is, whether you would be willing to do it, because based on what you've shown us today, you might be the only person who can help us stay ahead of this communication network. Before Sarah could answer, Captain Rodriguez looked up from his screen with an urgent expression.
Admiral, we've got a problem.
I'm seeing increased communication activity across all the intercept points. Something is happening. Sarah immediately turned back to her workstation and began pulling up the latest intercepts. As she scanned through the messages that had arrived in the last hour, her face grew pale. They know, she said quietly, her voice barely audible above the ambient noise of the busy room. They know what? Admiral Chen asked, moving to stand behind her chair. Sarah's fingers flew over her keyboard as she decoded message after message, each one confirming her growing suspicion. They know we're listening. Look at this series of communications from the last 45 minutes. She displayed her analysis on the main screen. The literal translations seemed innocuous. Discussions about weather, complaints about equipment, routine requests for supplies. But the decoded meanings told a completely different story. This message says the hunting season has ended early because the animals have learned to recognize the sounds. Sarah translated. That's a warning that their communications have been compromised. And this one from 30 minutes ago says the wise men suggest we use the old songs instead of the new ones. General Morrison leaned forward, studying the screen. What does that mean in practical terms? Sarah's expression was grim as she continued her analysis. It means they're switching to a different communication system. All the work we've done understanding their embedded dialect network may be useless if they abandon it for something else entirely. The room fell silent as everyone processed this development. Just when they had finally gained an advantage in understanding enemy communications, the enemy had apparently discovered the compromise and was adapting accordingly. But Sarah was still working, pulling up communications from earlier in the day and comparing them to the most recent intercepts. After several minutes of intense analysis, she looked up with an expression that mixed concern with professional excitement. There's something else, she said. The switch to the old songs isn't random. Based on the linguistic patterns I'm seeing, they're reverting to an even more traditional communication system. One that's based on actual songs and poetry rather than conversational embedding. Admiral Chen rubbed his temples, clearly feeling the weight of a situation that seemed to be growing more complex by the hour. Can you decode communications based on songs and poetry? Sarah nodded slowly. I can try, but it's going to be exponentially more difficult. Traditional songs and poetry in this region often contain historical references and cultural allusions that require extremely deep knowledge of local traditions and folklore. She paused, looking around the room at the faces of men who had dedicated their lives to protecting American interests, and who were now depending on her expertise to prevent what could be a military disaster.
Admiral, I'll deploy to the region, she said quietly. If they're switching to traditional songs and poetry for their communications, I'm going to need access to local cultural experts and historical documents that I can only find in the field.
And if we're going to stay ahead of their communication adaptations, we need to be working in real time with the intercepts as they happen. Admiral Chen studied her face for a moment, clearly weighing the risks of sending a civilian contractor into a combat zone against the potential intelligence value of her expertise. Colonel Williams, how quickly can we arrange deployment for Ms. Martinez with full security protocols? He asked. Colonel Williams was already reaching for his phone. I can have her on a transport to Kabul within 18 hours with a full security detail and access to all available cultural and historical resources in the region. Sarah felt her heart rate increase as the reality of what she had just committed to began to sink in. 24 hours earlier, she had been a graduate student working on routine translation contracts. Now she was about to deploy to one of the most dangerous regions in the world, to decode communications that could determine the safety of thousands of American personnel. There's one more thing, she said,
looking at Admiral Chen with an expression that mixed determination with uncertainty. If I'm right about their switch to traditional songs and poetry, we're going to need to move very quickly. Traditional communication systems in this region often include timing elements, specific songs or poems that are only meaningful when performed or recited at particular times or under certain conditions. Admiral Chen nodded grimly. What kind of timeline are we looking at? Sarah looked at her analysis one more time, then met his eyes directly. Based on the patterns I'm seeing, I think they're planning to execute their coordinated attacks within 72 hours. And Admiral, yes? I think the switch to traditional communications means they're moving to the final phase of whatever they've been planning. We may have just run out of time to prevent this attack through intelligence gathering alone. The weight of her words settled over the room like a blanket of urgent responsibility. The Admiral, who had laughed at her appearance just hours earlier, now looked at her with the kind of respect reserved for people who held the lives of others in their expertise. Sarah Martinez was no longer just a linguistic consultant. She had become a critical asset in a race against time to prevent what could be one of the most sophisticated attacks on American forces in years. The military transport aircraft that carried Sarah across the Atlantic Ocean was unlike anything she had ever experienced. The interior was stripped down to pure functionality. Rows of jump seats bolted to the metal frame, no windows except for small portholes near the crew area, and the constant drone of engines that seemed to vibrate through her entire body. She sat surrounded by 23 soldiers heading to various deployments, their combat gear and weapons secured around them, with the practiced efficiency of people who had made this journey many times before. Sarah clutched her laptop bag and tried to process the rapid sequence of events that had brought her here. 18 hours earlier, she had been sitting in the Pentagon conference room. 6 hours ago, she had been rushed through an accelerated security clearance process that normally took weeks. 3 hours ago, she had been fitted with body armor and given a crash course in battlefield communication protocols. Now she was flying toward Afghanistan with classified intelligence that could prevent a coordinated attack on American forces. Sergeant First Class Maria Santos, who had been assigned as Sarah's security detail leader, sat in the jump seat across from her. Santos was a compact woman with intense dark eyes and the kind of confidence that came from multiple combat deployments. She had been briefed on Sarah's mission in general terms, though the specific details of the linguistic intelligence remained classified above her clearance level. "First time in country, ma'am?" Santos asked, her voice raised slightly to carry over the engine noise. Sarah nodded. "First time anywhere like this, actually. I've never been in a military aircraft before today." Santos studied Sarah's face for a moment, taking in the nervousness that Sarah was trying hard to conceal. What kind of work brings a civilian contractor to Kabul on this kind of priority deployment? Sarah had been briefed on how to answer this question without revealing classified information. "Language analysis. I work with communication intercepts. Must be pretty important communication intercepts to warrant this kind of transport priority," Santos observed. "We bumped 3 other passengers to make room for your mission." Before Sarah could respond, the aircraft's communication system crackled to life. "All personnel, this is the pilot. We're beginning our descent into Bagram Airfield. As usual, this will be a tactical approach to minimize exposure time. Please ensure all gear is secured and prepare for a rapid landing sequence." Sarah felt her stomach drop as the aircraft began a steep descent that was unlike any commercial flight she had ever experienced. Through one of the small portholes, she caught glimpses of the Afghan landscape. Brown, mountainous terrain dotted with compounds and roads that looked like thin lines drawn across the desert. "Ma'am," Santos said, leaning forward to speak more directly to Sarah, "when we land, you stay close to me and my team. We'll have transport waiting to take you directly to the intelligence facility at Kabul. The situation on the ground has changed since your mission was approved." Sarah's attention snapped to Santos immediately. Changed how? Santos glanced around at the other passengers, clearly considering how much she should say in front of them. "There was an incident at Firebase Charlie early this morning. Coordinated attack on 3 positions simultaneously. No American casualties, but it showed a level of tactical coordination that has everyone concerned." Sarah felt her blood run cold. Firebase Charlie wasn't one of the locations she had identified in her original analysis, which meant the enemy coordination network was even more extensive than she had realized. How coordinated was the attack? Synchronized timing across positions that were 15 kilometers apart, with what appeared to be real-time communication during the assault, the kind of coordination that requires advanced planning and sophisticated communication capabilities. The implications hit Sarah immediately. The enemy network she had discovered was not only operational but actively conducting the kind of coordinated attacks she had warned about.
More concerning, they were doing it while apparently switching between different communication systems, just as her analysis had suggested they would. The aircraft touched down with a kind of jarring impact that suggested speed was more important than comfort. Within minutes, the rear cargo door was opening and soldiers were efficiently gathering their gear and moving toward the exit. Sarah followed Santos and her security team off the aircraft and into the harsh Afghan sunlight. Bagram Airfield was a massive complex of concrete runways, military vehicles and temporary structures that seemed to stretch to the horizon. The air was thick with dust and the smell of jet fuel, and the constant noise of aircraft operations created an atmosphere of urgent military activity. Sarah had never been in an environment where the reality of war was so immediately apparent.
A convoy of armored vehicles waited near the aircraft, their engines running and gunners visible in mounted turrets. Sarah realized with a start that these vehicles were here for her mission, that the priority level of her deployment was high enough to warrant this kind of security.
"Miss Martinez, I'm Colonel James Bradley," said a tall man in combat fatigues who approached their group as they reached the vehicles. "I'm the intelligence liaison for your mission. We need to move immediately to the secure facility where you'll be working." As they climbed into the lead vehicle, Colonel Bradley briefed Sarah on developments that had occurred during her flight. "We've intercepted 17 new communications using what appears to be the traditional song and poetry system you identified. Our standard translation teams can't make any sense of them, and we're concerned that we're missing critical intelligence about follow-up attacks." Sarah opened her laptop as the convoy began moving through the base. Even in the armored vehicle, she could hear the sounds of military operations around them. Helicopters overhead, vehicles moving in formation, radio chatter from the communication systems.
"Can you play me some of these intercepts?" she asked, connecting her headphones to the secure communication system. Colonel Bradley handed her a device loaded with audio files. "These are the most recent ones. They're all very short, usually less than 30 seconds each." Sarah began listening to the first intercept and immediately recognized what she was hearing. A man's voice singing what sounded like a traditional folk song about shepherds and their flocks. To anyone without deep knowledge of regional cultural traditions, it would sound like exactly what it appeared to be, a simple song with no tactical significance. But as Sarah listened more carefully, she began to pick up the subtle variations that indicated embedded meaning. The singer was using specific melodic patterns and word choices that transformed the innocent-sounding lyrics into tactical instructions. "This first one is about movement," she said, pausing the audio to explain to Colonel Bradley. "The song talks about shepherds moving their flocks to higher ground where the grass is sweeter. But in the traditional context, that's instructions for units to move to elevated positions that provide tactical advantages." She continued through the remaining intercepts, each one revealing additional layers of the enemy communication network. They were using traditional songs to coordinate not just movement and timing, but also supply logistics, personnel assignments, and operational security measures. "Colonel," Sarah said, looking up from her analysis, "this is more sophisticated than anything I've seen before."
They're using regional songs that have been adapted for military coordination, but they're doing it in a way that preserves the cultural authenticity of the original songs. Unless you understand both the traditional meanings and the military adaptations, these communications are completely invisible.
The convoy had reached the intelligence facility, a complex of hardened buildings surrounded by multiple layers of security barriers. As they prepared to exit the vehicles, Colonel Bradley received a message on his radio that made his expression grow serious. "We've got another development," he said to Sarah. "Intelligence teams at 3 different locations are reporting similar song-based communications, but they're all using different regional variations. It's like they have multiple networks operating simultaneously, each one using the traditional songs from their specific areas." Sarah felt the complexity of the situation beginning to overwhelm her.
She had expected to work with a single communication system, but what they were discovering was a multi-layered network that incorporated different regional traditions and cultural knowledge bases. Inside the intelligence facility, Sarah was introduced to a team of military linguists and regional specialists who had been working around the clock trying to decode the song-based communications.
The facility was impressive, multiple screens showing real-time intelligence feeds, secure communication links to military units throughout the region, and analysis workstations that looked like something from a science fiction movie. "Ms. Martinez, this is Dr.
Ahmad Kazemi," Colonel Bradley said, introducing her to a middle-aged man with graying hair and intelligent eyes. "He's a cultural anthropologist who has been working in this region for over 20 years.
We thought his expertise might complement your linguistic analysis." Dr. Kazemi shook Sarah's hand with an expression that mixed hope with skepticism. I have reviewed some of your preliminary analysis and I must say it is impressive work. But I am concerned that the traditional songs being used for these communications may require cultural knowledge that goes back many generations. Sarah nodded, understanding the challenge he was describing. That's exactly what I'm worried about. Some of these songs may reference historical events or cultural traditions that aren't documented in any written sources. Over the next 4 hours, Sarah and Dr. Cosme worked together to decode the accumulated intercepts, combining her linguistic expertise with his cultural knowledge. What they discovered was both fascinating and deeply concerning. The enemy network was using traditional songs that incorporated references to historical battles, tribal agreements, and cultural traditions dating back centuries. The songs themselves were authentic traditional pieces, but specific variations in melody, rhythm, and word choice conveyed tactical information to listeners who understood the cultural context. Look at this pattern, Sarah said, showing Dr. Kazemi her analysis of 12 related intercepts. They're using songs that tell the story of Ahmad Shah Durrani's campaigns in the 18th century, but they're adapting the narrative to describe modern tactical situations. Dr. Kazemi studied the analysis with growing amazement. This is extraordinary. They are essentially using historical military campaigns as templates for modern operations, embedding the tactical instructions within traditional cultural narratives.
As evening approached, Sarah realized that they had uncovered something unprecedented. The enemy communication network was not just sophisticated, it was culturally authentic in a way that made it nearly impossible to detect or decode without deep knowledge of regional history and traditions.
But more importantly, the pattern of communication suggested that the coordinated attacks she had originally identified were just the beginning. The enemy was using traditional cultural knowledge to build a communication system that could coordinate military operations across the entire region. And they were doing it in a way that was virtually invisible to conventional intelligence gathering methods.
Colonel Bradley, Sarah said, looking up from her analysis workstation. We need to contact Admiral Chen immediately. What we've discovered here changes everything about the scope and sophistication of the threat we're facing.
As Colonel Bradley reached for the secure communication link to Washington, Sarah realized that her mission had evolved far beyond anything she had originally understood. She wasn't just decoding communications anymore. She was uncovering a military and cultural strategy that could reshape the entire nature of conflict in the region. The Admiral had laughed at her appearance because she looked like a young academic who was out of place in a military setting, but her expertise was revealing that sometimes the most dangerous enemies were those who understood their own culture deeply enough to turn traditional knowledge into modern weapons.
And sometimes the only way to counter that kind of threat was to find someone who could think like both a linguist and a soldier, someone who could understand not just what people were saying, but what their cultural traditions allowed them to mean without ever saying it directly.
The secure communication link crackled to life at 0347 hours local time, connecting the intelligence facility in Kabul directly to the Pentagon War Room, where Admiral Chen and his team had been working continuously for 36 hours. Sarah had been analyzing intercepts for 14 straight hours, sustained by military-grade coffee and the adrenaline that came from knowing that lives depended on her ability to decode communications that no one else could understand.
Admiral Chen, this is Colonel Bradley in Kabul. The transmission began. I have Miss Decha Martinez here with critical intelligence updates. Admiral Chen's voice came through with the kind of exhaustion that spoke of command decisions made under extreme pressure. Go ahead, Colonel.
What has Ms. Martinez discovered? Sarah leaned toward the microphone, her voice steady despite the magnitude of what she was about to report.
Admiral, we've uncovered a coordinated operation that's significantly larger and more sophisticated than our original assessment. The enemy is using traditional cultural songs to coordinate what appears to be a multi-phase campaign across the entire Afghanistan-Pakistan border region. She paused, organizing her thoughts to deliver information that would fundamentally change American military strategy in the region. They're not just planning attacks on specific targets. They're coordinating a systematic campaign designed to coincide with American troop withdrawals and create maximum strategic impact. The silence from Washington lasted several seconds before Admiral Chen responded. Explain what you mean by systematic campaign, Miss Martinez. Sarah looked at Dr. Gall. Kazemi, who nodded encouragingly, then began to outline what their analysis had revealed. The traditional songs they're using tell the story of historical military campaigns that drove foreign invaders out of the region, but they're adapting these historical narratives to coordinate modern operations that mirror those ancient strategies. She clicked through her analysis on the screen that was being shared with Washington. The songs reference specific phases of historical campaigns: initial strikes, cutting supply lines, isolating strongholds, and coordinated final assaults. Based on the timing patterns we've identified, they're currently in the second phase.
Admiral Chen's voice carried a new level of urgency when he responded. What does the second phase involve in practical terms? Kazumi leaned toward the microphone. Admiral, this is Dr. Kazumi. In the historical campaigns referenced in these songs, the second phase involved cutting enemy supply lines and communications. If they're following the traditional pattern, he was interrupted by an urgent voice in the background of the Pentagon transmission. Sarah could hear someone saying, Admiral, we're getting reports of coordinated attacks on supply convoys in sectors 7 and 12. The pieces clicked together in Sarah's mind with horrible clarity. Admiral, they're using the traditional songs not just for communication but as an operational template. They're literally following historical military strategies that were successful against foreign forces in this region centuries ago. Colonel Bradley had been monitoring communication intercepts in real time while Sarah worked on her analysis. Now he looked up from his station with an expression of growing alarm. Ms. Martinez, we're getting new intercepts. Multiple short transmissions using the song format you identified. Sarah immediately shifted to her workstation and began analyzing the new communications. As she decoded each message, the scope of the current operation became clear. Admiral, they're moving to Phase 3, she said, her voice tight with urgency. The historical template suggests this involves simultaneous attacks on isolated positions to prevent mutual support between American units. Admiral Chen's response was immediate. All American positions in the region are being notified to expect coordinated attacks within the next 12 hours. Colonel Bradley, what's Ms. Martinez's assessment of our ability to predict their specific targets? Sarah was already working on that exact question. Cross-referencing the historical military campaigns referenced in the songs with current American positions in the region, what she discovered made her stomach drop. Admiral, the traditional songs reference specific geographic features that served as strategic targets in the historical campaigns. When I mapped those references to current American positions, she paused, double-checking her analysis because the implications were almost too significant to believe. Admiral, they're targeting every major American installation in the region simultaneously. This isn't just about fire-based Delta or isolated harassment operations. They're planning to attack 17 different positions in a coordinated assault designed to overwhelm American response capabilities. The silence from Washington was deafening. After several long moments, Admiral Chen's voice returned with the kind of controlled intensity that spoke of crucial decisions being made. Ms. Martinez, I need your best assessment of timeline. When will these coordinated attacks begin? Sarah looked at her analysis of communication timing patterns cross-referenced with the historical template the enemy was following. The traditional songs told a story of patience, careful preparation, and then swift, decisive action timed to coincide with natural phenomena that would provide tactical advantages. The songs reference attacks that begin when the morning star touches the eastern mountains, Sarah said. In the traditional context, that means dawn. But more specifically, it means the pre-dawn darkness, when visibility is minimal but there's enough light for coordinated movement.
She looked at the tactical display showing the positions of American forces throughout the region. Admiral, based on the communication patterns and the historical template, I believe the coordinated attacks will begin at approximately 0500 local time tomorrow morning.
That's 18 hours from now. Admiral Chen's response came quickly. All units are being placed on highest alert status.
Ms. Martinez, is there anything in these communications that indicates specific attack methods or weapon capabilities? Sarah continued working through the intercepts, focusing now on subtle variations in the traditional songs that might indicate tactical details.
What she found was both impressive and terrifying. Admiral, the songs include references to thunder from the mountains and fire from the sky. In the traditional context, these refer to attacks from elevated positions using ranged weapons. But the specific variations suggest they have access to advanced weaponry, possibly including rocket-propelled grenades and potentially anti-aircraft capabilities. Dr. Kazemi had been analyzing parallel streams of cultural references in the communications. He looked up from his work with an expression of profound concern. There is something else, he said, addressing both Sarah and the Washington connection. The traditional songs they are using conclude with a phrase that translates roughly to, "and the land was cleansed of foreign presence." In the historical context, this referred to campaigns that continued until all foreign forces were eliminated or driven from the region. The implications hit everyone in the room simultaneously. The enemy wasn't planning a limited operation or a harassment campaign. They were conducting what they saw as a final campaign to drive American forces completely out of the region. Sarah continued her analysis, but now she was searching for something specific. Any indication in the communications of how
The enemy intended to conclude their campaign.
What she found in the most recent intercepts made her blood run cold. "Admiral," she said quietly, "there's a new element in the latest communications.
They're using a traditional song that tells the story of a great victory celebration, but the timing references suggest this celebration is planned for 3 days from now."
She paused, checking her analysis one more time before continuing. "Admiral, I think they're planning to complete their entire campaign within 72 hours.
They intend to attack all American positions simultaneously, prevent effective response or reinforcement, and achieve what they consider final victory within 3 days." Admiral Chen's voice when he responded carried the weight of command decisions that would affect thousands of lives.
"Miss Martinez, you and your team have provided intelligence that has potentially saved more American lives than we may ever know. Based on your analysis, we're implementing immediate strategic response measures." Colonel Bradley had been coordinating with American units throughout the region based on Sarah's intelligence. He looked up from his communication station with an update. "Admiral, all American positions are implementing defensive measures based on Ms. Martinez's analysis. We're also coordinating with Allied forces in the region to provide mutual support during the expected attack window." But Sarah was still working, driven by the understanding that her analysis might be the only thing standing between American forces and a coordinated assault designed to overwhelm their defensive capabilities.
In the latest intercept, she was beginning to detect something that might provide a crucial advantage. "Admiral, I'm seeing something in the communications that might give us an opportunity," she said.
The traditional songs include timing elements that are very specific. They reference coordination based on natural phenomena like wind patterns and animal behavior that are observable in real time. She pulled up her analysis of these timing references. "If we can monitor the same natural indicators they're using for coordination, we might be able to predict not just when the attacks will begin, but the specific sequence and timing of strikes at individual locations." Admiral Chen's response was immediate. "Explain how we can use this information." Sarah worked through her analysis, identifying the natural phenomena referenced in the songs and mapping them to specific geographic locations. The songs reference "the wind that carries the scent of home" and "the cry of the mountain eagle" as timing signals. "Based on local weather patterns and wildlife behavior, I can predict when these natural phenomena will occur at each target location." She paused, realizing the implications of what she was suggesting. "Admiral, if I'm right about this timing system, we might be able to predict the exact sequence of attacks down to the minute. That could allow American forces to be ready for each assault as it begins." Over the next 6 hours, Sarah worked with meteorological data and wildlife behavior patterns to create a timeline that predicted when the natural phenomena referenced in the enemy communications would occur at each target location. What emerged was a detailed battle plan that allowed American forces to prepare for coordinated attacks with unprecedented precision. When the first explosions lit up the pre-dawn darkness at Firebase Charlie at exactly 0547 local time, American forces were ready. When rocket-propelled grenades began impacting the perimeter of forward operating base Hammer at 0551, defenders were already in position with counterfire coordinates pre-plotted. The coordinated assault that was designed to overwhelm American response capabilities instead encountered prepared defenses that had been organized based on intelligence no one else could have provided. Over the next 12 hours, what the enemy had planned as a swift campaign of overwhelming victories became a series of failed attacks against forces that seemed to anticipate their every move. Sarah monitored the battle from the intelligence facility in Kabul, watching as her linguistic analysis translated into tactical advantages that saved American lives across the region. Communications intercepts confirmed that enemy forces were increasingly confused by the prepared American responses, and their coordination began to break down as their carefully planned timeline fell apart. By evening, the coordinated campaign that was supposed to drive American forces from the region had failed completely. Enemy casualties were significant while American losses were minimal thanks to advance warning and prepared defensive positions. Admiral Chen's final transmission to the Kabul facility came as reports confirmed the failure of the enemy campaign. "Miss Martinez, your linguistic analysis and cultural expertise have prevented what could have been the most successful enemy operation against American forces in this region. You have demonstrated capabilities that have fundamentally changed how we understand intelligence gathering and analysis." Sarah sat back in her chair, exhausted but satisfied that her work had achieved its purpose. She thought about the long journey from that Pentagon conference room where Admiral Chen had laughed at her appearance to this moment when her expertise had helped prevent a military disaster. The Admiral had laughed because she looked like someone who didn't belong in a world of military strategy and tactical planning. But her knowledge had proven that sometimes the most effective weapons against sophisticated enemies are the tools of understanding. The ability to hear conversations that others can't detect, to recognize patterns that others miss, and to translate cultural knowledge into tactical advantages. In a war where information could mean the difference between victory and defeat, Sarah Martinez had demonstrated that sometimes the most valuable soldiers are the ones who fight with expertise rather than weapons, and sometimes the greatest victories are won by people who understand that real strength comes from knowledge, preparation, and the courage to trust in your own abilities even when others doubt them.
The Admiral had learned that appearances can be deceiving, but Sarah had learned something equally important. That expertise has its own kind of courage, and sometimes the most important battles are fought not with guns and explosives, but with understanding and the willingness to risk everything to protect people you've never met, but whose lives depend on your ability to decode the conversations that no one else can hear.
The Admiral laughed at her appearance, until she spoke 4 words that changed everything.